June 24th, 2009, 11:50 at night. Inside the Staples Center in Los Angeles, a 50-year-old man is dancing. He's been rehearsing since 9. He's run through Thriller. He's run through Dangerous. He's about to close with a song about the planet dying, and no one in that room knows they are watching a man who has, by every measure that matters, less than 36 hours left to live. There is footage of this night. Real footage. Cameras were rolling for a concert film that was never supposed to be a eulogy. Instead, it became the last moving images the world would ever have of Michael Jackson alive. In the next few minutes, we're going to walk through those final days, hour by hour. The rehearsal footage, the paparazzi photographs taken outside his rented mansion, on the 911 call that changed everything, and the trial testimony that finally told the world what actually happened behind closed doors on Carrollwood Drive. Some of what you're about to hear was hidden for years. Some of it was captured almost by accident. A photographer in the right place, a camera that happened to still be rolling, a phone call that was recorded because, legally, all emergency calls are. This isn't speculation. This is the documented, camera-verified, court-tested timeline of the last days of the King of Pop. Stay to the end, because there's one detail from the autopsy report that even hardcore fans still argue about today. Let's go back to the beginning of the end. To understand the final days, you have to go back 3.5 months to a stage in London. On March 5th, 2009, Michael Jackson walked out in front of the press and announced, "This is it, a 50-date residency at London's O2 Arena." His first extended run of live shows in over a decade. The announcement moved 750,000 tickets in a matter of hours, crashing 2 pre-sale websites in the process. For a man whose finances were, by most accounts, in serious trouble, this was framed as the ultimate comeback, a new beginning. Proof that the King of Pop still had an audience. The deal itself was massive. AEG Live wasn't just promoting a tour, they were effectively bankrolling Jackson's entire operation for months, covering everything from rehearsal space to security to, eventually, his personal physician's monthly retainer. 50 shows at the O2 Arena meant 50 nights of performance, but it also meant an enormous financial machine built around one man's body, holding up under pressure for the better part of a year. Every delay cost money, every missed rehearsal raised questions in boardrooms that had nothing to do with Jackson. His well-being and everything to do with insurance policies, ticket refunds, and production schedules already locked into venues on the other side of the Atlantic. That's an important piece of context for everything that follows. And this wasn't just an artist choosing to come back on his own terms. It was a heavily leveraged commercial production with dozens of stakeholders, all of whom had a financial interest in Michael Jackson staying healthy enough to perform, but not necessarily the expertise, or in some cases the incentive, to notice how badly that health was actually deteriorating behind the scenes. Rehearsals began in April at the Staples Center and continued through June. And this is the part most people don't realize. Almost none of it was meant for the public. AEG Live, the promoter behind the tour, later confirmed that around 100 hours of rehearsal footage had been recorded, originally intended for Jackson's own personal archive, and a short featurette for a future concert Blu-ray. Nobody was filming a documentary. They were filming a warm-up. That footage would later become the film This Is It. But in the moment, it was just cameras rolling because that's what professional productions do. And because those cameras were rolling, we now have an accidental video diary of a man's final weeks. On June 23rd, 2009, just 2 days before his death, cameras caught Jackson taking the stage at the Staples Center for an emotional run-through of They Don't Care About Us from his 1995 album, History. His vocal director, Dorian Holley, later said this rehearsal was the first time the full team had run through the show from top to bottom. It should have felt like a triumph. 2 days later, he'd be dead. But the story of these final days isn't a straight line from healthy to dead. It's uneven. Several accounts from people close to the production say that in earlier rehearsals that week, Jackson hadn't seemed as energetic, but then, on June 23rd, he suddenly regained considerable energy, running through a much larger portion of the set list than he had in days prior. Photographer Kevin Mazur, who'd worked with Jackson for 20 years and was present that night, captured him performing They Don't Care About Us at least twice. He was up. He was down. He was up again. That pattern, the swinging energy, the missed days, the sudden bursts, is one of the clearest signs in hindsight that something behind the scenes was seriously wrong. Now we need to introduce the second most important figure in this story, Dr. Conrad Murray. Murray was a cardiologist, not a sleep specialist, not an anesthesiologist by primary trade, but by the spring of 2009, he had become Michael Jackson's personal physician, reportedly hired at a rate around $150,000 a month, funded through the tour production. By the time rehearsals for This Is It were underway, Jackson had been drained by chronic insomnia severe enough that it caused him to miss rehearsals repeatedly, and it left him relying heavily on Murray. This is the piece of the puzzle that wouldn't become public until much later in a Los Angeles courtroom. Murray had been administering propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic, not a sleep aid, normally used to put patients under for operations, to Jackson virtually every single night for weeks as a treatment for his insomnia. It was never approved for this use. It was never supposed to leave a hospital setting without full monitoring equipment. To understand how unusual this was, it helps to know what propofol is actually for. It's the drug anesthesiologists use to put patients under general anesthesia before surgery. In a hospital or surgical center, a patient receiving it is hooked up to continuous monitoring, oxygen support is standing by, and a trained anesthesiologist never leaves the room. It is not, under any accepted medical guideline, a treatment for insomnia. It doesn't produce natural sleep. It produces a medically induced unconscious state that mimics sleep, and the margin between an effective dose and a fatal one is dangerously thin without the right equipment and personnel present. Administering it repeatedly, night after night. In a private bedroom, with no anesthesia machine, no continuous oxygen monitor, and no second physician present, was, according to the medical experts who later testified at trial, a practice with essentially no precedent in legitimate medicine. That's the arrangement Michael Jackson had apparently been living inside for weeks by the time cameras were rolling on those final rehearsals. A man performing complex choreography by night and being placed under surgical anesthesia to sleep by early morning, on a loop that had no real off switch. Producer Ken Ehrlich told reporters that Jackson really looked good and was very upbeat, describing him as cracking jokes and having a good time during rehearsals, a description that, on the surface, contradicts everything we now know was happening to his body every night behind closed doors. That's the tension at the heart of this entire story. On camera, in rehearsal footage, Jackson often looked engaged, sharp, even joyful. Off camera, inside a rented mansion on Carrollwood Drive, his body was being pushed through a nightly cycle of sedation that no medical board would ever have approved. His longtime makeup artist, Karen Fay, later said that after a costume fitting in the days before his death, Jackson seemed frustrated, repeatedly asking her why he couldn't choose, a small human detail that hints at a man who felt he'd lost control over decisions in his own life, at the exact moment the world thought he was staging his comeback. Fay also stated she overheard an AEG executive saying Jackson should keep rehearsing, despite what she described as his visibly declining health. Whether that pressure came from ambition, denial, or simple corporate momentum, it's one of the details that would later be scrutinized heavily when Jackson's family sued AEG Live over his death. 6 days before his death, on June 19, 2009, something happened that, in retrospect, should have been a red flag loud enough to stop everything. Jackson arrived for what was supposed to be a rehearsal, but before it could even begin, he became ill and had to be sent home for the day. This was meant to be the final rehearsal before the whole production physically relocated to the Staples Center for the last stretch of preparation. Instead, cameras and crew watched the headline act get sent home sick. 6 days before opening night was supposed to begin its final countdown. Rumors circulated afterward that Jackson had, in fact, powered through and rehearsed the full set list that night anyway, but that claim has never been confirmed. What we do know is that this was the pattern of his final week. Illness, absence, a burst of energy, then illness again. By the time production moved to the Staples Center for the final stretch, insiders were already privately worried. The show was 17 days from opening night in London, and the man at the center of it was barely sleeping without medical intervention that should never have been happening in a private bedroom. June 23, 2009, 2 days before he died. This is widely regarded by fans, by crew, by the footage itself, as the last time Michael Jackson looked and performed like Michael Jackson. During the rehearsal, while working through the ending of The Way You Make Me Feel, the team kept the final 8 bars of the song intact, even though it had apparently been decided in earlier sessions to cut them. A small technical detail, but it shows a production still being actively shaped, still evolving, still very much alive. After running I Want You Back, Jackson reportedly expressed discomfort with the in-ear monitors the show was using, saying he was more accustomed to traditional stage monitors after decades of performing that way. It's such an ordinary complaint, the kind of note any performer might give a sound engineer. And that's exactly why it matters here. It's proof that on June 23rd, Jackson was still thinking like a professional preparing for a 50-night run, not like a man with 2 days left. According to people close to the production, Jackson arrived early that afternoon but didn't actually start rehearsing until around 9 p.m., reportedly because he was in meetings about a potential CBS Halloween special built around his 1997 short film Ghosts. That night, the team ran through 3 full songs, Dangerous, Thriller, and Earth Song, with the latter, 2 eventually appearing in the final This Is It film. He was, by all footage and all accounts, deeply present that night, engaged with the choreography, cracking jokes with the crew. It's one of the reasons his death 2 days later hit the production so hard. This wasn't a man visibly fading on camera. This was a man who, on screen, looked like he still had 50 shows left in him. Now, the day, The one the cameras happened to capture in full because it turned out to be the last one there would ever be. Jackson arrived at the Staples Center around 5 p.m. on June 24th. Before rehearsal started, magician Ed Alonzo, who'd been hired to help build the opening segment of the show, spoke with him. Jackson jokingly complained of laryngitis. Alonzo would later say Jackson looked great and had great energy. Before the rehearsal, Jackson also sat in on a meeting with producer Ken Ehrlich, AEG President Randy Phillips, AEG Chief Executive Tim Leiwick, and his longtime manager Frank DeLeo, discussing that same CBS Halloween special centered on ghosts. It's a small, almost mundane business meeting, and it's also proof that, as of the afternoon of June 24th, Jackson was actively planning projects for October. He was thinking months ahead. That night, the team ran 3 full-song run-throughs: Dangerous, Thriller, and Earth Song, with Thriller and Earth Song among the footage later used in the concert film. It's likely he only rehearsed the introduction of the Earth Song segment, the part involving the giant animatronic Black Widow spider, along with the final choreography block with his dancers, since available footage doesn't show him wearing his usual headset microphone during that section. Earth Song turned out to be the very last song Michael Jackson ever performed on any stage, in any form. There's something almost unbearably poetic about that. Whether or not you believe in poetic justice, a song about the death of the planet, performed by a man with hours left to live in front of a set piece shaped like a dying globe. Before he left that night, Jackson finally got to see, from offstage, the full globe skeleton set piece and backdrop that had been built for the global medley segment of the show, the last piece of the production to be finished during that rehearsal. The session ran into the early hours of June 25th, ending just hours before Jackson's death. Multiple sources close to the production say the rehearsal didn't wrap until around 2 a.m. Think about that timeline for a second. He was dancing, rehearsing choreography, looking at set pieces for a show that was still weeks from completion at 2 o'clock in the morning, roughly 9 hours before paramedics would be called to his home. One small detail fans still point to: earlier that year, a fan had given Jackson a brown necklace as a gift, and he wore it through the entire press run and rehearsal period for This Is It, including, based on photographs, that final night. It's a strange thing to fixate on, but it's one of the last visible, tangible objects connecting the public Michael Jackson to the private man who went home that night and never woke up. This is the part of the story that wasn't captured by rehearsal cameras. This part comes from a different kind of recording: the emergency call, the paramedic logs, and years later, sworn courtroom testimony. According to the timeline established at trial, in the early hours of June 25th, Dr. Conrad Murray administered a combination of sedatives to help Jackson sleep, culminating, according to his own later statements to police, in a final dose of propofol, the anesthetic he had reportedly been giving Jackson nightly for weeks, administered around the pre-dawn hours. Murray would later tell investigators he left Jackson's bedside for a period of time. Reports vary on exactly how long, but courtroom testimony placed it at roughly 10 to 20 minutes, during which he was not directly monitoring a patient under the effects of a surgical anesthetic. When he returned, Jackson was not breathing. At 12:21 p.m. on June 25, 2009, a call came into Los Angeles Emergency Services. It's a matter of public record, released as all 911 calls legally are in the aftermath of the case. The caller, later identified as a member of Jackson's staff with Murray coaching in the background, reported that a 50-year-old male was not breathing and that CPR was already in progress. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Jackson was already in cardiac arrest. He was transported to UCLA Medical Center, where doctors continued resuscitation efforts for over an hour. At 2:26 p.m. Pacific time, Michael Jackson was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old. Within minutes, the news broke publicly, first as rumor, then as confirmed fact across every major outlet simultaneously. Websites crashed under the traffic. It remains one of the most searched news events in the history of the internet up to that point. Crowds gathered outside UCLA Medical Center within the hour, some in tears, some simply standing in stunned silence, watching news vans multiply along the street. Outside Neverland Ranch, hundreds of miles away, fans who had no formal connection to the property began leaving flowers at the gates almost immediately, a pattern that would repeat outside the Apollo Theater in Harlem, outside Motown's old headquarters in Detroit, and outside record stores across multiple continents by nightfall. Radio stations abandoned their regular programming to play his music on loop. It was, by any measure, one of the largest simultaneous outpourings of public grief for an entertainer in modern history, and it happened within hours of a death that 12 hours earlier, nobody outside a small circle of medical staff had any reason to expect. A public memorial service was held on July 7, 2009, at the Staples Center, the same building where Jackson had rehearsed just weeks before. An estimated global television audience in the hundreds of millions watched performances and tributes from family, friends, and fellow artists. It was, in a strange and unplanned way, a kind of final show in that same arena, held in the exact space where the real final show was supposed to have started rehearsals for a very different reason. Back at the Staples Center, where the crew had continued working through the morning unaware of what was happening, director Kenny Ortega called everyone together to hold hands and pray after word came that Jackson had been hospitalized. For about half an hour, people went back to their tasks, still hoping, until Ortega gathered the team again, this time to confirm that Jackson had died. That moment, the prayer circle, then the second gathering, then the news, was captured on camera too. Some of that footage appeared briefly in the trailer for This Is It, though the full conversation was never included in the final film or any special feature. According to people who've studied the footage closely, some of the shots used in that trailer, including the moment the team gathered to pray, were actually filmed during the early morning hours of June 25th, at the tail end of what turned out to be Jackson's final rehearsal. In other words, some of the very last footage ever shot of the This Is It production shows, without anyone realizing it, in the moment, the beginning of the end. It would take nearly 2 years, and a criminal trial, for the full picture of those final hours to reach the public. In November 2011, Dr. Conrad Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in connection with Michael Jackson's death. Prosecutors argued that Murray's use of propofol as a nightly sleep aid, entirely outside any hospital setting, without the monitoring equipment that procedure would normally require, and without proper emergency preparedness, constituted a severe deviation from the standard of care a physician owes a patient. Murray was sentenced to 4 years in county jail, of which he served roughly 2, and the California Medical Board later revoked his license to practice medicine. The trial itself ran for roughly 6 weeks and drew intense media coverage, in part because it was one of the first major criminal trials to be broadcast live and gavel to gavel, allowing the public to watch expert witnesses walk through, in granular medical detail, exactly how propofol behaves in the human body, how quickly it can suppress breathing without proper monitoring, and how long it likely took for Jackson to die once his heart stopped receiving adequate oxygen. Nurses and paramedics testified about the chaotic scene inside the bedroom when they arrived, including the presence of medical equipment that witnesses said seemed improvised for a home setting rather than designed for it. Murray's own defense argued that Jackson had, at some point when left alone, administered an additional dose of drugs himself, a claim the jury ultimately did not find persuasive enough to outweigh the core allegation that Murray's overall pattern of care fell so far outside acceptable medical practice that he bore criminal responsibility regardless of that final detail. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office ruled Jackson's death a homicide, a legal classification meaning death caused by the actions of another person, not necessarily implying criminal intent in every case, but reflecting the direct medical causation between Murray's actions and Jackson's death. The official cause of death was determined to be acute propofol intoxication, with other sedatives found in his system contributing to the outcome. That's the piece of information most casual fans still don't fully absorb. The propofol wasn't a contributing factor among several possibilities. It was, according to the coroner and the criminal justice system, the direct and primary cause of death. There was a second, separate legal battle that followed. In 2013, Jackson's mother, Katherine Jackson, brought a wrongful death lawsuit against AEG Live, arguing the company had negligently hired and supervised Murray. That trial dragged the same footage, the same rehearsal timeline, and the same behind-the-scenes testimony from Karen Fay and others back into public view, this time under oath. The jury ultimately found that AEG had indeed hired Murray, but ruled that AEG was not liable for his conduct, since Murray was found to be competent for the job at the time he was hired, even though his subsequent treatment of Jackson turned out to be catastrophic. AEG was not held financially responsible for Jackson's death. That contrast, the man dancing at midnight on June 24th versus the man being pronounced dead 13 hours later, is the entire tragedy of this story compressed into one 12-hour window. On camera, preparing for the biggest comeback of his career. Off camera, the victim of a medical arrangement that should never have existed in a private bedroom in the first place. Of the roughly 100 hours of rehearsal footage that had been recorded, originally meant only for Jackson's personal use and a short Blu-ray featurette, Sony and the Jackson estate assembled a full theatrical documentary. This, as it was released in October 2009, just 4 months after his death, and became one of the highest-grossing concert documentaries in history. For millions of fans, it remains the closest thing to closure they'll ever get. 90 minutes built almost entirely from footage nobody ever intended the public to see, showing a performer who, for all his private struggles, still looked, on stage, like he had one more great show left in him. Fans who've studied the raw footage closely still point out details the cameras caught almost by accident. A few seconds of amateur audio smuggled out of a rehearsal by fans who'd snuck into the building. Split-second clips of Jackson singing live that never made the final cut. Moments preserved not because anyone planned them, but because a camera simply happened to be running. That's ultimately what makes this story different from most Hollywood tragedies. There was no single dramatic moment captured on film, no on-camera collapse, no visible warning sign frozen in a frame for history. Just a man rehearsing a show, night after night, while something invisible and irreversible was happening to his body every single time the cameras stopped rolling. 16 years later, the footage from those final rehearsals is still some of the most watched Michael Jackson content that exists, not because of the choreography, though it's extraordinary, but because of what we now know was happening just off camera in the hours between rehearsals. A comeback that was 17 days from beginning, a physician administering an operating room anesthetic in a bedroom, a production crew that, until the very last morning, had no idea anything was wrong. In the years since, the This Is It rehearsal footage has taken on a strange second life. It's been studied frame by fans looking for any sign, however small, of what was coming. It's been used in university courses on entertainment law and medical ethics as a case study in what can go wrong when commercial pressure, celebrity, and private medicine intersect without real oversight. And it's been revisited again and again in documentaries, retrospectives, and yes, videos exactly like this one, because it remains one of the only windows anyone has into who Michael Jackson actually was in the final weeks of his life, as opposed to who the tabloids or the rumors said he was. What the footage doesn't show, and what no camera ever could have shown, is the part that ultimately mattered most, a nightly ritual happening behind a closed bedroom door, invisible to everyone on that production, including the man experiencing it. The cameras were rolling for a concert that never happened. What they captured instead was something nobody involved ever intended to film: the very last days of Michael Jackson's life. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know in the comments which detail surprised you most, and subscribe for more deep dives into the moment's history almost missed on camera.